In the audience who haven't yet had a chance to read The Hired Man, can you explain a little bit about the setting and then perhaps go into the first reading?
Well, The Hired Man it's a very simple story. It's set in Croatia, in a part of Croatia that's known as the Krajina, very briefly became the Republic of Serbia Krajina in 1991 when the Serbs tried to create a separate state. It is an exquisitely beautiful part of the country, just a couple of hours inland from the coast. And the story is simply the story of a woman called Laura, who's British, who arrives having bought a holiday home there with her husband, or a house that they hope will become a holiday home. They bought it with their husband, and she's bought it with her husband. And she arrives with her two children to do it up. Her husband is actually stuck in Britain on some work. There's a man who lives nearby, a local man, and she meets him apparently by accident, and he knows the house quite well, is a handyman, and becomes quite useful to her in doing the first of the renovations to the house. He's also a hunter. At sundown I walked the dogs on the hills. The lights of Gost separated me from a vast darkness. The sea, 2 hours drive away. Zeka picked up a scent and ran ahead with her nose to the ground, Cos behind. I left them for a short while to see where they were headed, and then called them to heel before they could disappear into the pine plantation. Together we entered the trees. Inside it was closer to night. The pine needles were soft underfoot, soundless. There is a place where the deer gather on the other side of the plantation, and the trees give way to a clearing. At about 50 meters from our destination, I told the dogs to go down and wait for me, which they did, sinking slowly to their haunches. They liked to pretend they didn't care, Cos and Zeka, but under the skin every nerve and muscle twitched. I moved slowly forward, balancing my weight on the outside edges of my feet. Every 10 steps I stopped and listened. In the silence of the forest, I counted on hearing the deer before I saw them, and so it happened. A group of 8, grazing at the edge of the clearing. A young doe lifted her head at my approach. I froze. She glanced about nervously before she lowered her head again. 7 does, 2 bucks. Bucks were younger, less than a year old probably. The doe who'd raised her head was closest to me and perhaps 3 years old. I lifted my rifle, set my sights on her, and released the safety catch. She grazed on, her body angled away from me. I watched and waited. She might have sensed me, for she lifted her head a second time and looked to the left and right and then in my direction. An ear twitched. Neither of us moved. Then she relaxed and lowered her head. Reaching for another morsel, she shifted her footing and presented her broadside to me. I placed the crosshair at her temple, took a breath, exhaled, squeezed the trigger, and watched her drop. At the sound of the gun, the rest of the deer fled. Cos and Zeka were at my side, ready to follow the blood trail if there was one, but I didn't need them today. She'd fallen exactly where she'd stood. The sky had turned to a deep blue, and it was too dark now to dress her in the woods, so I hoisted her onto my shoulder and headed in the direction of home. For 2 days my thoughts had been crowded by memories of Krešimir and of Anka. It felt as though I'd been lifted up and set back in time. Back in that time, the events of which I'd found a way to live with. I'd had no choice. None of us had, though some were better at it than others. Now I remembered how here, where the ravine meets the pine trees, we'd seen our first boar. Anka, wearing yellow pop socks, stands upon a rock, showing off her balance on tiptoe, her arms above her head like a dancer in a musical box. Slowly she extends one leg behind her, an arm in front. She's wearing a yellow skirt which matches her socks, and it ruffles in the breeze. Otherwise, she is impressively still. I've opened my mouth to cheer when I see her expression and follow her line of sight to the first row of trees. There, in the no man's land of shadows and sunlight, a boar, huge. Slowly I raise my gun and take aim. I miss, thank God, because the gun is a pea shooter and would doubtless only have made him mad. The bullet ricochets off a tree. The great beast shudders, regards us a moment longer, and is gone. Anka jumps off the rock and into my arms. We walk home exultant. Nobody bothers to mention that I really shot a tree and not a boar. Kreshami and I are 14, Anka is 10. The year is 1975. I stood in it and inhaled the cold scent of the pine, the bass note of leaf mould, made all the more powerful by the darkness. I closed my eyes and tried to imagine 1975, and then opened them before a picture could come. I whistled for Koz and Zeka, and we returned by way of the road. Light flared between the shutters of the blue house. I stood on the road, facing the house, the warm corpse of the deer over my shoulder, the dog silent by my side. Somebody, Laura, crossed in front of an upstairs window. I stood there for some minutes more until Koz spoke, soft whine, and we turned towards home. I lay awake thinking about the past, things I hadn't thought about for years. Somewhere nearby the vixen called, an awful sound. I'd seen her. She came some night circling the house to search for scraps to take back to her half-grown cubs, and drawn that night by the scent of the deer I'd dressed in the yard a couple of hours before. She taunted the dogs, and the dogs answered, racing up and down their pen, barking and howling, clawing the wire mesh. Next morning, the Tuesday, I arrived early at the Blue House. In my hand, I held a chisel. A few years after the house first became empty, somebody had plastered and whitewashed a section of the facade. The job had been hastily done. I checked nobody was around, and then I scraped at a layer of the plaster, loosening a portion which I pulled away with my fingers. I stood there for a few minutes, scraping and tossing lumps of plaster into the tall grass. I stopped and stood back. Now you could see part of what lay beneath, a patchwork of small blue and green tiles made of glass and clay, the same as the ones lying on my windowsill. Inside, Laura was talking on her mobile phone. The day was clear and the sky pale blue. On many days, the mountains blocked the reach of the mobile networks, but that day the invisible force field that seemed to surround Gost so much of the time had lifted. Laura pointed to the phone in her hand and mouthed something to me, then waved a hand at the coffee pot on the table next to a single cup. She left to finish her call upstairs. No sign of either the son or the daughter. I carried my coffee outside and set to work, removing paint from the windowsills. An hour on, Laura came out to see how I was doing, then left to go into town. When she came back, I set down my tools to help carry the groceries from the car. More coffee, which we carried outside. Laura turned her face to the sun, closed her eyes for a few seconds, and then opened them again to take a sip of her coffee. Her eyes roamed the front of the house. When she noticed the place on the wall where I'd scraped away the plaster, she stood up and went over to inspect it, running her fingertips across the tiles. I watched her for a bit, and then I said, "What is it?" "Something's under here," she replied. "It looks like a mosaic."
Thank you very much. This is such a wonderful, patient story.